The auctioneer's gavel came down with a crack, and Margaret Brennan became the owner of 43 acres of Mountain Valley that no one else would touch. Lot 17, the Holloway parcel. Creek, timber, and a cave the size of a barn right in the middle. The crowd chuckled. Everyone knew that land. Old Thomas Holloway had tried for 15 years before giving up. The cave made proper farming impossible. Too much rock, too little soil, that dark mouth breathing cold across the pasture. Margaret had studied the property twice. She'd stood under the cave's overhang and felt the temperature stay steady while January bit at her hands. She'd seen something Thomas Holloway never imagined, a roof she wouldn't have to build. When bidding stalled at $48, Margaret raised her hand. She counted out nearly everything from selling her house, the house she couldn't keep alone after Samuel's death. The whispers followed her. The widow's lost her mind. That cave will kill her and those children. Margaret collected her daughters from the wagon. Anna, 10 years old and watchful. Little Catherine, barely 3, who still asked for her father at bedtime. They had 2 trunks, a cook stove, and a plan so fragile Margaret barely dared think about it directly. They reached the property at dusk. The cave loomed larger than memory, its overhang stretching 40 feet across, cutting into the hillside like a wave frozen in stone. The creek ran swift and clear 20 yards from the cave mouth, and beyond it, dark pines climbed toward the ridge. "Mama, I'm frightened," Anna whispered. Margaret was frightened too, but she'd learned that fear and forward motion could coexist. "Help me with the canvas," she said instead. "We'll make camp tonight." She'd planned for this. Planned with the kind of desperation that sharpens thinking rather than clouds it. The cave floor was uneven but dry, scattered with old leaves and the remains of Thomas Holloway's discards. Working by lantern light, she and Anna swept out a corner, laid down oilcloth, spread their blankets. The cook stove went just inside the cave mouth where smoke could escape. Margaret built the first small fire, boiled water from the creek, made mush from the cornmeal she'd packed. Catherine fell asleep mid-bite. Anna ate silently, then asked, "What are we building, Mama?" "A life," Margaret said. "But first, a sheepfold." The look on Anna's face, confusion warring with trust, nearly broke her. But Margaret had done the mathematics. She had $27 left. Lumber for even a small barn would take most of that. But she had a cave with a stone roof that would never leak, walls on 3 sides that would never rot, and space enough for 30 sheep to winter safely. If she could buy the sheep, if she could make them thrive, if she could spin their wool and sell it before her money ran out. If. She fell asleep with her daughters pressed against her, the cave breathing its steady, cold breath, and stars she couldn't see wheeling overhead. The work began before true dawn. Margaret woke to Catherine's whimpering and Anna's patient attempts to soothe her. In the thin light, the cave looked like a mouth ready to swallow them. Margaret pushed the thought away and built up the fire. She'd brought axes. She'd brought a handsaw. Most importantly, she'd brought knowledge. Her father had been a carpenter before he'd been a farmer, and he'd taught her to see how wood wanted to fit together, how weight distributed, how a joint should lock. The sheepfold came first because it had to. She scoured the property for fallen timber, finding oak and ash that had come down in some ancient storm. She cut rails, split stakes, drove them deep into the cave floor where the stone gave way to packed earth. Anna helped, her small hands learning to hold steady, while Margaret swung the hammer. The pen took shape slowly, a solid barrier that would keep sheep contained, protect lambs from the draft at the cave mouth, create sections for separating animals. Margaret built hay racks from stripped saplings, assembled them with the patience born of having no money for mistakes. "Why here?" Anna asked on the third day, as Margaret fitted corner posts. "Why in the cave?" Margaret paused, wiping sweat despite the cold. "Feel how it is here. Not warm, but not freezing either. The cave holds the earth's warmth. Snow can pile 6 feet deep outside, but here the sheep will stay dry. They'll birth their lambs here, and the lambs won't freeze." Anna's eyes widened. "We're going to have lambs?" "We're going to try." The cabin came next. She chose a spot near the creek, but high enough to avoid spring flooding. The foundation was creek stones, hauled one by one and fitted into place. Anna proved surprisingly good at selecting stones that nestled together. Margaret cut dead or dying trees, sectioned them, stripped bark, notched ends with an axe that grew heavier each day. The cabin rose, one log, then another. She chinked gaps with moss and clay from the creek bank. The roof was rough-cut cedar shakes, laid in overlapping rows. The fireplace took 5 days. The stones had to fit precisely. The flue had to draw. When she lit the first fire and smoke rose clean through the chimney, Anna clapped. They moved in on a Sunday, 12 feet by 14 feet, 2 sleeping platforms, shelves, a table from split logs. The windows were oiled paper, but they let in light and kept out wind. "It's ours," Anna said, touching the wall with something like wonder. "It is," Margaret agreed, then more quietly, "Now we need the sheep." She walked to town on a Monday, leaving Anna in charge with strict instructions. The November cold had settled deep, but the path along the creek was becoming familiar. 3 miles to the main road, another 2 into town, past houses where lamplight glowed yellow and the smell of roasting meat made her stomach clench. She found Jacob Kern at his farm just south of town. She'd learned he raised sheep and occasionally sold his breeding stock. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, surprise plain on his weathered face. "I heard you'd bought the Holloway place. Folks say—" He stopped, perhaps remembering courtesy. "Folks say I'm foolish," Margaret finished. "They might be right. But I need ewes, Mr. Kern. Young ones, bred for fall lambs. How many can I buy for $20? His eyebrows rose. $20 is all you have? $20 is all I can spend on sheep. He studied her for a long moment. You planning to winter them in that cave? I am. Thomas Holloway couldn't make that land work. Thomas Holloway tried to farm against the cave. I'm planning to farm with it. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite respect, but a willingness to be convinced. I've got 6 ewes I could part with. All bred, should drop lambs in February or March. $20 for all 6. But I'm only doing it because I'm curious whether you'll make it work. I'll make it work. You'll need a ram eventually. One thing at a time, Mr. Kern. She walked back to the property with the ewes following on tethers, their bells chiming softly in the cold air. It took all afternoon. By the time they reached the creek, true dark was falling, but she could see Anna had built up the fire outside. Her daughter stood waiting, eyes wide at the sight of the animals. 6 sheep, Anna breathed. 6 sheep, Margaret confirmed, and they're counting on us. She led them into the cave, into the pen she'd built. The ewes explored their new space, nosing at the hay she'd managed to cut and cure from the narrow meadow upstream. The cave stillness seemed to settle them. By full dark, they were lying down, chewing cud, their presence making the cave feel occupied rather than empty. Margaret sat on a stump outside, watching smoke rise from both the cave mouth and the cabin chimney. $27 reduced to 7, everything riding on 6 pregnant sheep and her ability to make something no one else had seen. Anna came and sat beside her. "Mama, what if they're right? The people in town?" "Then we'll know we tried our best," Margaret said, but she was thinking, "They won't be right. I won't let them be." December brought snow, 3 feet in one storm, then another foot the next week. The valley transformed into something from a winter tale. Every branch waded white, the creek running dark between ice-rimmed banks, the cave mouth breathing out warmer air that formed clouds in the frigid morning. Margaret worked through it all. The bridge across the creek had to be built. She couldn't risk wet crossings all winter. She felled 2 pines, stripped them, laid them across the narrowest point she could find. Anna helped drag smaller logs for decking, and together they lashed everything with rope Margaret had hoarded from the house sale. The bridge held. Margaret tested it first, then crossed with both girls, their feet echoing hollow on the wood. From the other side, she could see the whole property, cabin tucked against the hill, smoke rising, the cave dark and vast beyond, sheep occasionally visible inside. "It looks like a real place," Anna said. Margaret understood. It looked like somewhere people were meant to be. But that was also when the isolation truly settled in. In town, people had whispered. Out here, there was no one to whisper. The snow erased any path to neighbors, not that she had neighbors. The nearest was the Johnsons, 3 miles north, and they'd made clear they thought Margaret's venture was doomed. The sheep became her calendar. She checked them twice daily, learning their habits, their personalities. The brown ewe was bossy. The smallest one, Margaret started calling her darling, always wanted scratching behind her ears. Margaret studied their bodies, watching for signs of lambing, reading books she'd borrowed from the town library before leaving. Anna learned with her. Together they sat in the cave while Catherine napped in the cabin, their breath frosting as they watched the sheep, and Margaret explained what to look for: the udder filling, the ewe seeking isolation, the restlessness before labor. "Will they all survive?" Anna asked. "Some might not," Margaret said honestly, "but we'll do everything we can." The first lamb came on a February morning when ice coated every surface. Margaret woke to Anna shaking her shoulder. "Mama, the brown one is acting strange." They hurried to the cave, lantern swinging. The brown ewe was circling, pawing the ground, clearly uncomfortable. Margaret had prepared for this. She'd read about it, planned for it, but knowledge and experience were different territories. She sent Anna to boil water while she examined the ewe. The lamb was coming front feet first. Good. But the ewe was struggling. Margaret waited, patient, stepping in only when the labor stalled. When she finally pulled the lamb clear, slick and steaming in the cold cave air, it didn't move. "No," Anna whispered. Margaret rubbed the lamb with hay, clearing its nose and mouth. She rubbed harder, faster, and suddenly it gasped, coughed, tried to stand on wobbling legs. The ewe turned, and Margaret had to back away fast as the mother's instinct kicked in. She watched the ewe lick her lamb clean, watched the lamb find its feet, watched it nurse for the first time. "We did it," Anna said, tears on her cheeks. "She did it," Margaret corrected. But she felt it too, the fragile, fierce hope. 11 more lambs came over the next 6 weeks. 10 survived. Margaret and Anna learned through trial and terror. How to help without interfering, when to step in, how to warm a weak lamb by the cabin fire and return it to its mother. The cave filled with bleeding, and even Catherine learned to help, fetching clean rags and sitting very still to watch the babies. By April, the flock had grown to 16, and Margaret had a new problem. She needed income. The water wheel was madness, but logic pushed her forward. Wool needed carting. The creek ran year-round with steady power. A water wheel could drive a carting machine, maybe even a small grindstone. The Johnsons rode 6 miles to mill their grain. If Margaret could grind locally, she could charge for the service. She studied the creek for days, finding a natural spot where water dropped 3 feet over a limestone shelf. Perfect for power. The wheel required lumber she couldn't afford, so she salvaged planks from Holloway's abandoned farmhouse. She carved a shaft from oak. She traded her last good dress for iron bearings from a salvaged wagon. The construction took all of May. She built the frame, mounted the axle, attached paddles. Each paddle had to be angled correctly, secured with wooden pegs and rope. She fell into the creek twice. The first test failed. The wheel turned backward. Margaret cursed and redesigned the paddle angle. The second test was better. By the third, it was working. The wheel spun steadily, and when she engaged the simple drive belt to a carding drum, it turned. Anna whooped, and Margaret felt something she hadn't felt since Samuel died. Wild, fierce joy. Word reached town by July. Mrs. Patterson stopped her outside the general store. "I hear you've built some kind of contraption." "A water wheel, for carting wool and grinding grain." What Margaret didn't know was that the Pattersons owned shares in the mill 6 miles south, or that a woman running her own operation challenged more than economics. Mr. Patterson refused her credit. Can't extend credit to someone on bad land with children to support. The blacksmith wouldn't sell her nails. The carpenter wouldn't part with lumber. Even the church ladies began talking about poor decisions and those motherless children. Still, the work continued. Margaret sheared her sheep, washed fleece in the creek, carded it, and spun by firelight. By September, she had yarn to sell. Mrs. Hayes examined it and nodded. Good work. $8. $8 for 3 months of work. But it was more than she'd had. Walking home, she ran into Jacob Kern. He'd heard about her water wheel. "Is it true you're grinding grain?" "Small batches. I haven't worked out rates. The mill charges 1/10. Could you do better?" 1/12, same-day service. He studied her. "You're either very clever or very desperate." "Probably both." He laughed. "I'll send my son with 20 bushels tomorrow." The wheel did well. Word spread slowly. A few farmers tried Margaret's service. She charged less, worked harder, and built a small customer base. But she'd made an enemy. Thomas Waite owned the southern mill and sat on the town council. When Margaret's operation cut into his profits, he spread rumors. The water wheel was dangerous, the cave unhealthy, those children being raised wild. Then came sabotage. Someone damaged her sluice gate. She fixed it in 2 days. A week later, someone left her sheep pen open. She found 3 ewes wandering near the road. Anna found a note. "Go back to town where you belong." Margaret pulled it down. That night, she acknowledged the fear. She was alone out here. But leaving would mean admitting defeat, and she had nowhere to go. Her money was in this land, these sheep, that wheel. She decided to stay, to be more careful, to protect what she'd built. Then came the blizzard. It hit in early December with a fury that turned the world white. Margaret had been watching the sky, reading the signs, the clouds piling up north, the strange stillness in the air, the way the sheep pressed close together even before the first flakes fell. "Stay inside," she told the girls. "Don't go out for anything." The snow began mid-morning and didn't stop for 3 days. It fell so thick Margaret couldn't see the cave from the cabin. The wind screamed around their walls, finding every gap in the chinking, every weakness in the construction. Snow piled against the door until Margaret had to dig it clear just to check the fire. On the second day, Anna asked, "What about the sheep?" Margaret had been trying not to think about the sheep. They had food. She'd stocked the cave with hay. They had shelter. But she couldn't check on them. Couldn't know if they were safe. "They're in the cave," she said. "They're protected." But she didn't know, and the not knowing ate at her. On the third day, the snow stopped. The wind kept blowing, sculpting drifts that buried the bridge, the woodpile, half the cabin. Margaret dug her way out at first light, leaving the girls inside with strict instructions. The valley was transformed, snow 6 feet deep in places, the creek invisible except where dark water showed in gaps. The path to the cave was erased. Margaret waded through drifts that came to her chest, fighting for each step, her breath harsh in the brutal cold. The cave mouth appeared slowly, dark against white, smoke still rising from where she'd banked the fire before the storm. Margaret's heart was pounding, not just from exertion, but from fear of what she'd find. She climbed over the last drift and into the cave. All 16 sheep were alive. They clustered at the back, warm from their own body heat and the banked coals of the fire Margaret had maintained. The hay racks were still half full. The pen had held. The cave's steady temperature and solid roof had done exactly what Margaret had counted on. She stood there, snow melting off her coat, and felt something break loose in her chest. Relief so intense, it was almost painful. While neighbors had likely lost animals to the cold, her careful preparation had paid off. The thing everyone mocked, the cave itself, had proven its worth. "You're all right," she whispered to the sheep. "You're all right." The brown ewe, the first one to lamb, came and nosed her hand as if to say, "Of course we are. This is what you built for." Margaret checked every animal, examining hooves and bodies for cold damage, redistributing hay, breaking ice on their water. She built up the fire, added more hay to the racks, and made sure each sheep seemed healthy and calm. When she was satisfied they'd weathered the storm better than she'd dared hope, she started back to the cabin and found a man standing by her bridge, Thomas Waite. She recognized him from town, heavy-set, prosperous, with a face that expected deference. "Mrs. Brennan," he said. "Quite a storm." "It was," Margaret said carefully, aware that she was alone with him, that the cabin was 30 yards away with her daughters inside. "I came to see the operation everyone's talking about. Your water wheel, your cave barn." He looked around as if evaluating a poor investment. "Impressive that you've survived this long. I plan to do more than survive. That's what I wanted to discuss." His voice was pleasant, but his eyes were cold. "You've been undercutting the mill's prices, taking business that should rightfully go to established operations. I charge fair prices for good work. You charge desperate prices because you're desperate. It's not sustainable, Mrs. Brennan, and it sets a bad precedent." Margaret's hands were freezing, but she kept her voice steady. "Is there a point to this conversation, Mr. Waite? I'm offering to buy you out. A fair price, probably more than you paid. You can move back to town, find proper work, raise your daughters somewhere they'll have a future." "My daughters have a future here." "Do they?" He gestured at the snow-buried valley. "Look at this place. You're one bad winter, one broken wheel, one sick child away from disaster. I'm offering you a way out." "I don't want a way out." His expression hardened. "You're being foolish, and foolish people get hurt. Is that a threat?" "It's a fact. Accidents happen. Equipment breaks. People who don't belong somewhere eventually figure that out. Margaret met his eyes. She was cold, exhausted, and frightened. But she was also the woman who'd built a cabin, delivered lambs, and made a water wheel work with her own hands. "I belong here," she said. "This is my land, my operation, and my choice. If that's all, Mr. Waite, I have daughters waiting." She walked past him to the cabin, feeling his eyes on her back, refusing to hurry or show fear. She didn't relax until the door was closed and barred behind her. Anna looked up from where she was entertaining Catherine. "Who was that?" "No one important," Margaret lied. But that night, she didn't sleep. She planned instead. How to protect the wheel, how to watch for sabotage, how to prove her operation was not just surviving, but succeeding. Spring came with a rush of meltwater and sudden warmth. The snow retreated, revealing a valley scraped clean and ready for renewal. Margaret's sheep had made it through, all 16 adults, and the ewes were pregnant again. But more importantly, word had spread about the blizzard. People had heard that Margaret's livestock had survived when others in the valley had lost animals to the cold. They'd heard about her cave barn, how the temperature had stayed stable, how her preparation and unconventional thinking had paid off. A few, not many, but a few, began to reconsider their dismissal of her methods. Some admitted quietly that maybe the widow knew what she was doing after all. Jacob Kern brought grain every 2 weeks now. His wife bought yarn regularly. 2 other farmers tried Margaret's milling service and were satisfied enough to return, then to recommend her to others. It wasn't acceptance exactly, but it was acknowledgement. And that was a start. The real change came in late April when the Johnson family, her nearest neighbors, lost their barn to a spring fire. Lightning strike, nothing they could have prevented, but it left them with livestock and nowhere to shelter them. Thomas Johnson appeared at Margaret's property on a gray morning, hat in his hands, the pride clearly costing him. "Mrs. Brennan, I know we haven't been neighborly, but I'm in a situation. I've got nowhere to keep my stock until I can rebuild." Margaret waited, letting the moment stretch. This was what she'd both wanted and dreaded, the chance to repay cold treatment with grace or cruelty. She looked at Thomas Johnson, proud, uncomfortable, desperate, and thought about what kind of person she wanted to be, what kind of example she wanted to set for her daughters watching from the cabin door. "I have space," she said. "Back section of the cave, past the sheep pen. I'll need help building a partition, and you'll have to manage your own feeding. Rate is $2 per month per head. That's more than fair. Thank you. And Mr. Johnson?" She waited until he met her eyes. "When your barn is rebuilt and your cattle go home, I'd appreciate it if you remembered that the cave everyone mocked kept your stock safe." His face reddened, but he nodded. "I'll remember." Word of that exchange spread faster than any gossip about her supposed failures. By June, 3 more families had asked about renting cave space for storage. Hay, equipment, seed grain that needed to stay dry and cool. Margaret charged modest rates and made more in 2 months than she'd made all previous year. The water wheel kept turning. The sheep kept thriving. And slowly, grudgingly, the community's relationship with Margaret Brennan began to change. Thomas Waite never apologized. He never acknowledged his veiled threats. But when his mill's water source ran low during a dry August, and he needed to divert flow temporarily, he came to Margaret to negotiate access to the creek. She agreed to a fair arrangement and charged him market rates for the privilege. By the time winter came again, the property had a name in local conversation: the Cave Farm. Not as an insult anymore, but as a description. The place where that widow had made the impossible work. 2 years after Margaret bought the land, she stood outside the cabin on a December evening and took inventory of what she'd built from nothing. The cabin had a real window now, glass she'd saved for and installed herself, replacing the oiled paper that had barely survived 2 winters. The bridge was reinforced with additional supports. The water wheel ran smooth and reliable, its rhythm as constant as breathing, servicing a dozen regular customers who now trusted her work. Her flock had grown to 25 sheep, producing enough wool to supply 2 weavers in town and interest from a merchant in the county seat. Anna, 12 now, could card and spin as well as her mother. She'd also taught herself to keep accounts, tracking income and expenses in a ledger with careful precision, her neat columns showing steady profit. Catherine, 5, helped feed the sheep and could recite each one's name and personality, treating them like extended family members. They weren't rich. They'd never be rich. But they had food, heat, security, and something Margaret valued more than wealth: autonomy, independence, the freedom to live by their own labor and decisions. The cave rose behind the cabin, its dark mouth exhaling warmth into the cold air. Inside, the sheep were bedding down for the night, safe and fed, their contentment audible even from here. The water wheel's distant splash was a constant rhythm, proof of work done and work continuing, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Margaret had learned something in these 2 years. The thing everyone calls worthless might only be waiting for someone to see it differently. The cave that made the land unusable was the reason the land worked at all. "Mama?" Anna appeared beside her, carrying firewood. "Mrs. Hayes wants to know if we can supply 20 more skeins by next month." "We can," Margaret said. "We'll need to card extra this week." "I can help." "I know you can." They stood together in the gathering dark, smoke rising from the chimney, lamplight glowing yellow through the glass window. From the cave, a sheep bleated softly, and another answered. Margaret had bought this land because it was all she could afford. She'd made it work, because she had no other choice. But somewhere in the building, and the planning, and the stubborn refusal to fail, it had become more than survival. It had become home. She put her arm around Anna's shoulders, and together they walked inside, leaving the cold and the dark behind. Tomorrow would bring more work. There was always more work. But tonight, there was warmth, family, and the quiet satisfaction of a day ended well. The cave stood watch behind them, no longer a curse but a shelter, no longer worthless but priceless. And Margaret Brennan, who'd been called foolish and desperate and wrong, had proven the only thing that mattered, that she knew exactly what she was doing all along.